Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. This is the sixth in my overall series reread and overview of the classic Hardy Boys original canon books. And for this reread, I decided to do a back-to-back reading of the revised text I grew up with, and finally doing a comparison read with the original text that I've only read sporadically through the years after tracking down various vintage used editions to complete a set of the original 38 original texts. As I've discussed in the past videos on this series and in other Hardy Boys videos I've done, the original text, what that refers to is the original books were mostly written by Leslie McFarlane, the primary ghostwriter of the series, who started everything after being given a prompt, essentially, by the Straightmare Syndicate. And the idea was that the series would be ghostwritten under the name of Franklin W. Dixon. So Leslie McFarlane wrote the majority of the original books, just as Mildred Benson wrote the majority of the original Nancy Drew books. However, after a certain point in 1959, the Syndicate decided it was time to essentially modernize the books and remove elements that were not just dated in terms of the actual, say, technology on display or things like that, but of some unfortunate cultural stereotyping and things that was part of the original books that go all the way back to the original text of the Tower Treasure in 1927. However, while those were, fortunately more on the minor side in terms of the amounts of dated stereotypes and things you see, and it's understandable that they would want to do that, in doing this, they actually wound up severely cutting the page count, and the first thing to go was all of the beautiful character and world building that McFarlane had put into the books, and the boys also lost quite a bit of character depth and detail, and so did their chums and other supporting characters. And the whole world of Bayport, USA, and the world of the Hardy Boys lost a lot of not just humor, but really shades of gray that gave it a greater sense of realism. And the boys lost some of that two-fisted quality they had, that ultra resiliency, which they still retain a good degree of in the revised text, don't get me wrong, but when you do these comparison rereads, it becomes very obvious, particularly with the Leslie McFarlane written text, most of all, that there is a reason why people still bemoan the fact the books were rewritten. And it's not easy to talk about the revised text because they were all written over a different period of time, out of order, with differing levels of revisionism by completely different authors. So no two of the revised texts are really the same. Some only make minor changes, some change the plots around or add in subplots or make the original plot a subplot in a new plot under the same title, and then some are just completely different, and the only thing they have in common with the original book is they share the same title, and it's marketed like it's the same book when it clearly is not. All of these were, of course, ghostwritten as well, so until the development of fan culture and the ability to share information online, this stuff was very much, you either knew it or you didn't, and you could only dig up what information you could find. And I was a kid obsessed with the Hardy Boys, and then suddenly finding these strange older copies in libraries and antique stores that had the same title, but different cover art and different page counts, and in some cases were entirely different. So thankfully, this information is more available online, but I'd like to give that sort of preface for each of these videos I do. Now, to talk about book number 6, The Shore Road Mystery, you are talking about the original 1928 text written by series creator Leslie McFarlane, and then the 1964 revision done by Dave Grams. And this is one of those cases where I think the revised text very clearly shows the influence of one particular factor of 60s pop culture that you will find continually in the revised text. I think it's very difficult to not pick up on this feeling being a big influence and why the revised text had greater focus on not just action, but making the action set pieces even more grandiose, and trying to have a nice villain and a henchman, and having a bit more of the larger-than-life aspects that the original text didn't always get to because they were much more grounded. And that's the James Bond influence, and you get that all throughout the revised text of The Shore Road Mystery, even though it was 1964, which was the time Goldfinger was coming out, and of course pretty much took the world by storm. I do think in the immediate aftermath of the Bond phenomenon really exploding onto the world stage at this point, I think there is a definite James Bond influence in a good majority majority of the revised text, but particularly in the early to mid 60s, because the revision started in 1959 and they sort of hodgepodged all over the place in terms of which books they did over a certain period of time. But from 62, 63, 64 onward, the influence of James Bond on these is inescapable, really. And I think the Shore Road Mystery is a great example of this, because the level of action and the stakes of the action are so dramatically raised that it really stands as one of the best of the revised texts. And it's kind of hard to compare to the original text, because the original text doesn't have all of those action set pieces and things you get in the revised text, which is so beautifully put together. However, the original text is more grounded and I think more suspenseful, particularly in its climax, which is built up to rather nicely, and again has a greater deal of suspense than what you have in the revised text, which, as all the revised texts do, they had a different mandate, so they were not done in the same way as the original text, and they had far less pages to be able to tell the stories in, because the page count drops from about 212 pages in the original text down to about 178, I believe it is. The plot of the stories, at their core, have the similar theme of the boys going after a car theft ring that's propped up around Bayport and essentially instigating a sort of Trojan horse strategy to try and find them. That basically becomes the sort of third act climax of the story, and how the boys come face to face with the entirety of the gang. However, the build-up to that point is entirely different. And again, the revised text is much more about all kinds of action set pieces that are entirely new and originated for the book, while the revised text is entirely filled with new action set pieces throughout and has an entirely new subplot that changes the overall focus of the book. So instead of just being an attempt to locate the car theft ring, the Hardys find themselves trying to help family friends of theirs find a missing treasure, and of course, on top of that, then said friends wind up disappearing. So there's a potential kidnapping then involved as well. So again, the focus shifts around a little bit in the revised text, and it is much more convoluted. The stakes are higher, and the action set pieces inserted throughout the book are far more varied and far more developed, and that leads to the climax taking place in a relatively similar location, but it is far more convoluted, and there's much more going on, and there's more personnel involved, shall we say. So again, it is one of the most action-packed in terms of the revised text, and I do think it is one of the best revised texts overall. It's really well laid out, and it does manage to at least get the original idea of the story across, and even some of the methodology, and you can recognize some of the same structure, and again, the climax itself takes place in a relatively similar sort of area. And it goes without saying the pace is much more brisk, and it moves much faster in the revised text when compared to the original text, mostly because the page count is severely curtailed, so that definitely means you have to pick up the pace much more, which is a very common factor in all revised texts when you're talking about the 38 books. But I do think it is a remarkable sort of slight reinvention and reworking of the original story, and it's so filled with additional new content and again, the action set pieces. But in particular, one that's always stood out to me and is what the Hardys' number one pal, Chet Morton, finds himself doing. Because, of course, Chet Morton has to have basically a new hobby every book. And in this one, it's botany, but also he's decided to go on a diet. So the notorious Chet Morton is no longer trying to have 3 breakfasts and always be eating and enjoying the process. He's on a diet, and there's one particular scene that burned itself to my brain. It's one of, I think, the great classic Chet Morton moments, and it's exclusive to the revised text, but he is essentially on a stakeout for assisting the Hardys in their case, and was tasked by Aunt Gertrude to deliver a chocolate cake. And it's a blazing hot day, and Chet Morton is very hungry, and he's on a diet, and it starts to get hot, and then said cake looks more and more and more tempting as he's having to sit on this long stakeout in a hot car on a hot day. And it goes on over time, so that cake starts to look more and more tempting, and then decisions are made, shall we say, and then you have to try and cover up said decisions, and it just gets worse while things are going on outside of the car on the stakeout he's on. So it's just one of my favorite Chet Morton moments. It's one of the random bits that's always stuck with me, and I can always visualize it. So it was very interesting to see that was an exclusive thing in the revised text. Now, in comparing the actual writing quality, once again, it's, I think, unfair to compare them in that sense because the Leslie McFarlane texts are so much richer, so much, they feel much more like fully fledged novels, and you can really fully visualize not just the story, not just the Hardys themselves and the side characters and the villains, but you can visualize the whole world, and it's taking place, in the 1920s as opposed to the 60s, and it's a lot harder to get around, and the pacing, while it's slower and it doesn't have the rat-a-tat, constant fast pace of the revised text, there is something to be said for the strengths of having a more relaxed pace that befits the story being told. And again, the story isn't as complicated as what's in the revised text. It doesn't have all of the nice fun additions and bells and whistles and action sequences. There's not all of a sudden the Hardys are swimming and all of a sudden they're attacked by a skin diver underwater with a net. That doesn't happen in the original text, while it actually does happen in the revised text. The revised text also has the henchman with a sword cane being very menacing. So, there's lots of fun things like that in the revised text. So I think this is a case where you can recognize the bones of the original text and the revised text, but the revised text does so much and it adds so much, and it has the subplot that it really does kind of stand on its own. So I think it could be considered a different book, even though the core is still there. It's not entirely different. Like, it's not a completely different story with the same title, because again, you can recognize the structure and the car thieves and the Trojan horse strategy, but there's so much other stuff going on that it does kind of stand on its own. And so again, I think this is a case where the original text is the better written book, but again, the revised text had all these constraints placed against it. I really think David Grams did a remarkable job with the revised text. I do think it is one of the strongest books in the revision series. I think it still stands as one of the most solid entries in the original canon, and I think it's just eclipsed by the original text because it's hard to compare against the series creator and him not having to work to the much more constrictive guidelines of the revision process. So that's why I think it's important to read both versions of the book, and I just think this is one of those examples where the revised text has so much more in terms of all the fun bells and whistles that it's hard to discredit it if you love the original text. I think they go hand in hand rather well, and they do complement each other, but again, it's a shame that in this process it was decided to lose all of the world building and the humor and the shades of gray that Leslie McFarlane put in, because there is a distinct difference. And even though the original text is not as complicated and convoluted, and the stakes are not as high as what's in the revised text, the difference is the original text feels much more lived in, and the humor is so much more vivid and varied in the original text. And additionally, as I alluded to before, the climax itself has moments of really great suspense. That there are suspenseful bits in the climax of the revised text, but there is a lot more action going on, and it doesn't have the same build-up that the climax of the original text has. So, again, I think this is really a draw. Again, the original text is better written, but the revised text had a lot more constraints placed on it, and it comes up with so much new material and really good, strong material that I think you really need both. I think reading both is the way to go, and I think the revised text is one of the best of the whole revision process. Now to talk about the cover art designs, like I like to do. The original was done once again by W.S. Rogers in the same sort of design type as he did for the the original book. So we have an image depicting a moment from the actual book with the lovely painted cover, and then the title in red. As with all of Roger's covers, it may seem a bit simplistic at first, but it does fit the style he had established, and this is a moment from the book. Also, if you needed any convincing the story took place in the 1920s, well, I think this would tell you with the car being depicted on a shore road, and it looks like it's about to go off the side of the cliff. I think it holds up well. It's also got an actual storm going. It might not be easy to see unless you start looking closely, but there's rain and sort of windswept rain, and then a lightning bolt going off in the background. So it's another one of these covers that he did that you have to sort of look at it for a while and get accustomed to it. But it's a nice cover, especially for the era where I don't think you were really getting very vivid covers, especially not for children's literature. And of course, again, not when the dust jacket would be the first thing to go. But eventually that was replaced in the yellow spine era of the 1940s by the A.O. Scott cover. Now, this is another that would be redone by Rudy Nappy, so this sort of image lasted for the book for quite some time. Here we have Frank and Joe about to uncover the figures on the beach, tied up, and there's some nice sort of staging of how they're coming around the side of the cliff, and just the actual layout gives at least a little bit of a suspenseful note to it. But as I've said before, my issue with the Scott covers is they always have a slight cartoonish look to them. Even though he came up with some really great, striking visuals in terms of the composition, I've never been a fan of the look and the actual color used. It always makes it feel like a slightly cartoonish or a comic book of the era. That type of effect, they never seem quite as dynamic as they could be. But I like the composition once again, so it's more of a nitpick. But this would be another Scott cover redone by Rudy Nappy in 1960. This was basically the same cover, but as you can see, it's been flipped, so now the orientation is different, but it's done in Nappy's rather photorealistic style. Everything is much more detailed and sharper. The color is really nice, and I like the stark quality of the background sky. We still have the same scene of the figures being tied up on the beach and the boys discovering them, but there's just a greater, I think, sense of a greater dynamic sense. It's a much more striking cover, and at first glance you would think that having all of the dead space of the sky in the background, it seems a little plain with just the title sitting there in black, but I think there is something to be said for the starkness of that really giving at least a slightly ominous effect to it. I do think it is a stronger image. However, this didn't stay around for very long because very shortly thereafter, in 1964, it was deemed that Rudy Nappy should come back and do yet another cover, but do an original this time. This was pretty much because they were publishing the revised text and decided not to keep the previous cover because that event doesn't really happen in the revised text. So it was at least one of the times where the Straightmeyer Syndicate was smart enough to realize that and not hang on to a cover with at least some elements that didn't exactly exist in the book they were publishing under the same title. So here we have another dramatic scene, this time from the revised text, of the boys on motorcycles on the shore road, seeing the human fly characters. So again, you can see the revised text, if you're just looking at the covers, there's a bit more going on. Now we have the boys on motorcycles going at speed, and they've got radios on the back of their bikes, but we're looking at a human fly climbing up the side of a seaside cliff on a dark road with it looks like the crashing surf under him. So yeah, there's a bit more going on in the revised text. So this scene, of course, does not exist in the original text. I've always really liked this, even though once again there is quite a bit. If you want to nitpick, there's dead space in the center where we just have the road going into what looks like forest, but you're drawn to the boys in the lower left corner, and you have the human fly character climbing up again a seaside cliff wall over the ocean coming in. And it also looks like it's taking place at night because the boys have their headlights on and it's quite dark. And again, you get a little bit of an ominous flavor too. So it's a little more low key actually, but than some of the revised text. But I really do like this image, and this is the one that's burned into my brain. So it's hard for me to think of any other image when I talk about the Shore Road Mystery. So this is an example where the older covers fit the original text and the revised cover doesn't really fit the original text, but I still love it so much. So, but once again, Rudy Nappi is the definitive Hardy artist, I think, without question. So in 2017, as part of Penguin taking over the series, they did an updated cover for the Shore Road Mystery. So here we have the Matthew Taylor cover, which is in the same sort of style with the new stylized title logo and everything, but it's supposed to be an event from the book, I suppose, but it's going for a full-bore sort of very comic book type approach like the other covers, but this one's at least, it has an ominous looking figure in the front. It looks like there's flames in the background, but the sort of pinkish and purple hues along with the orange just looks a little weird. I'm not exactly sure what they were going for with this. I'm not really a fan of the color choices, but it's okay, but it's actually I think it's very nondescript. I have to say, of all of these, even though it looks like there's flames in the background, it to me at least, it seems like the least attention grabbing of all of the covers. I don't know, it's just something about it. It's again, I think it's okay, but it just doesn't scream Shore Road Mystery to me. And of course, you have the boys shrouded in darkness, so it doesn't even really quite look like them unless you realize it's supposed to be a printing of the Hardy Boys. So, yeah, it's a bit odd. I don't know. I'm not a fan of the redesign, and again, they stopped after a few books, but it's a little bit interesting, I guess. So, it's obviously not up to the Rudy Nappi cover it replaced, and like with all of these, I don't think there was a reason to replace them. They're trying to modernize the covers a little bit. I understand that, but I don't think the art was a problem. So yeah, I don't know. Some may like it, but I'm not exactly sure what they were going for with the redesign. Now let's talk about the additions in my collection briefly. For the original text, I have the Applewood Books replica. This is the beautiful series. They started in 1991. Unfortunately, after this book, Shore Road Mystery, they get increasingly scarce. So Shore Road costs a little more and is a little harder to find than the first 5 books. But after this, the Applewood book replicas get increasingly more expensive. And by the last few, they get really expensive. And whenever they pop up on eBay, I think all of us Hardy Boys fans who don't have all the Applewoods, we all try to see if we can snag one, but they go for quite a bit. Unfortunately, they never got to complete all 38 books, so it's really a shame because these are beautiful replicas, and of course, when you slip the cover off, they've recreated the original red hardcover of the original editions. For the original books, they are full replicas, but later on, for the later volumes, I should say, they didn't switch to the classic brown tweed they would have had. They kept the red boards, so those are not 100% replicas, but because of that, but that does kind of set them apart as the Applewood editions. Of course, they recreated the original dust flap inside, and then they also recreated the original front piece art because the originals had a lovely front piece art. This is on a sort of very glossy piece of photo stock paper, and there's no internal illustrations. That would only be in the revised text. These are a full replica that, of course, also replicate the original text block, page for page. So the actual text and the layout of the original and revised text is also different. That's Another key giveaway, if you're ever looking at a later picture cover edition, for example, from the 50s or 60s, and you can tell, okay, it's over 200 pages, but then also you want to look at the actual text layout because they are different. Next is my picture cover copy with the first nappy art, and this is still of the original text. I don't know how well this will come across on camera, but the actual printing is excellent. The color and the color depth is really great. Very much leaps off of the actual book itself. Of course, this would have been preceded by the actual hardcover with the dust jacket with this art. Now, this lists to Aztec Warrior and has the brown end papers, so that would date this as 1964. So this is very much the sort of last gasp of the original text because the revised text did come out in 64. So I guess I was lucky to find a copy from the last year. This has the revised art from the later 40s edition, so it's just printed on, depicting a scene from the original text, as opposed to the sort of photo paper version in the Applewood replica that replicates what's in the very first printings. But the text block is pretty much the same, replicating the original text, and of course the deck giveaway is that it's over 200 pages. Here is my copy in the flashlight edition of the revised text. So this has the second Rudy Nappy art. This is a 1999 printing, so that means it's well done and everything's centered and the cover is printed really well. But of course, like all flashlight editions, there is some cropping on the top and the side. We get the revised text front art and of course the revised text title page. And like all flashlight editions, the paper stock is a really bright white. So that's something that you won't get on older editions that are in the picture covers because this is using much newer recycled paper stock. Of course, we have the revised text block. The other thing is the revised text all had internal illustrations throughout of the sort of pencil line sketch type drawing variety. This is one of my favorite bits of skullduggery that happens at the Hardy household. All of a sudden, the boys are in the crime lab and a window shatters and they realize somebody threw a grenade in the room because, it's just what you do, I guess. And then one more, this is the scene I alluded to earlier. The Hardys are out on the water and then all of a sudden they're attacked by a skin diver who decides to grab one of the girlfriends and tie her up in a net and hope she drowns. So again, I guess that's just what you do because it's a would-be villain. And then the rear has the same cover as all the flashlight editions. And then I guess because I'm a completist, I found a copy of the 2017 edition. It does look better in your hands. I don't really know. I guess it's the color, the sort of very bright, dark, but still vibrant pink with the sort of flames and the boys in shadow. I don't know. But it does have the same sort of wraparound effect for some reason. It's broken up by a black spine, but as you can see, it's still glossy like one of the flashlight covers. So, it's at least nice that there's a sort of wraparound art design. I wish it really looked more like how I picture the book or something, So, again, it's nice they at least tried something, I guess, but I don't know. It just doesn't work for me. The inside is the same except for the updated title page. So that's my thoughts on The Shore Road Mystery, Book 6 in the classic Hardy Boys original canon series. I do think the revised text makes a number of welcome additions to the series and is a really strong book in its own right, but it still can't really compare to the original series creator Leslie McFarlane's work on the original text from 1928. So it's a bit of an unfair comparison, but I do think the revised text really holds up well. It's always been one of my favorite books to come back to, and I think it's really due to the inherent strengths and the action set pieces inserted into the more quickly paced revised text that make it so enjoyable. But once again, the original Leslie McFarlane text is the much richer, much more lived in experience and feels much more like a fully fledged novel. But it is interesting to see when the revised text can give it a run for its money. And I do think that happens in this case. So I think both books are still classics and still worthwhile and extremely enjoyable to come back to and read. But I think it's most revealing if you do like this and you read them back to back, because you can recognize the bones of the structure of the original text are still there in the revised text. But it's fascinating to see how it was sort of worked with and moved around and broken up and then inserted with a brand new subplot, and how that was woven in order to make a cohesive story in the revised text. So I think both books are excellent. I think they're both great examples of the strengths of the original text and the strengths of the revised text. So I think this is one of those books where you really win with both. There's no downside to either book, and I think the spirit of the original is maintained in the revised text. So until next time, when I return with my thoughts on Book 7, The Secret of the Caves, I hope this has been fun and informative to hear me babble about the boys even more, because it's a part of my life that has been there ever since I can remember, really. And without the boys, I don't think I would ever have become as big of a reader as I am still to this day. And I will never lose my fascination and enjoyment of going back and rereading the books and then trying to collect all the various editions and finishing off the continuation series and things, because you think it's easy, but it's really not, because you have to complete the canon series, and then you have to look at the continuations and the digests and the case files, and if you want to go into the later series, and then you also have to start getting all the original text, because you have to track down vintage editions to get the original 38 books, because even if you got all the Applewood editions, they stopped after a point, so you have to then find the rest in vintage editions. And with Dover reprinting the original text of the Tower Treasure, it is entirely possible they might reprint all 38 books, but due to copyright lapses, it's probably going to take some time before they get, if they continued with this, it's probably going to be some time before they got to book 38, so we'd all be significantly older. But thankfully, editions are still out there. They are available, and you can find at least good reading copies of the original text of the 38 books for decent prices, but it's the thrill of the hunt and trying to get good copies at good prices that makes it all the more interesting. So once again, I hope this has been enjoyable, and if you have any memories specifically of the Shore Road Mystery, I would love to hear about them in the comments below. It's still one of my favorites in the series, and I really had a blast coming back to it and doing this special double reread back to back. Until next time, when I return with The Secret of the Caves, as always, I would like to say, keep reading print books, and keep supporting your local independent bookstores, and thanks ever so much for watching.